Thanks, Jenny. We light our chalice, a symbol of our free faith, with the words of Matthew P. Taylor. This is titled The Change. I can feel the change coming, like growing pains. I feel the change in my bones, pulling me, stretching me, forming me into the true I am. Can you feel it? The change in our bodies as we adapt, grow, change, the weight shifting and molding to fit this evolving body that we are in, guided by faith that this too will pass. We can survive in this because our ancestors survived. Can you feel them in your DNA? You, a mixture of their particles that was molded to fit your spirit. Change and shift, mold and grow, yet in some ways we stay the same.
Please rise and as you are willing and or able and to sing the You hymn. May love be the spirit of this fellowship. May the quest for truth be its sacrament, and service be its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, and to help one another to fellowship. This is our aspiration. Now the reading. On a Sunday morning, the bells of the 3 churches in the village called all to come to meet, for the church was still spoken of as the meeting house. The bells did not interfere with one another. Whichever bell started ringing first would pause after the 2 or 3 minutes and let the others take up the summons. All 3 bells had individual tones, easily identified. The loungers on the hotel steps who never went to church not only recognized the notes of each, but were able to interpret what they said. According to their insight, the Methodist bell shouted, "Repent, repent." The Presbyterian bell urged, "Church time, church time." Only the Universalist bell held out a cheerful promise. No hell, it said. The loungers felt safe in staying where they were. Thus ends the reading. What's next? Time for
This is a story for our Time for All Ages that comes from a good friend of mine. He's the director of Lifespan Faith Formation at First UU San Diego, Tony Bianca. And this story is called The 99. So do any of you know the parable of the lost sheep? Anybody? Okay, a few of you, perfect. Okay, so for those who don't know, it's a very short story from the Christian tradition. Jesus is talking to a group of religious leaders who have criticized him for hanging out with people they didn't think he should be hanging out with. He says to them, and I'm paraphrasing this, If a shepherd had 100 sheep and one sheep wandered off and got lost, that shepherd would naturally go off and look for the lost sheep. And when the sheep was found, the shepherd would carry it back to the flock and call all their friends together and say, "Come and celebrate with me. I have found my lost sheep." The point of the story for Jesus was to say that the religious leaders shouldn't be upset that he is hanging out with people who aren't acting the way they think they should act. If anything, they should be celebrating because those people are interested in being part of the community again. When we tell that story, I think we sometimes focus on the wrong parts. We call the story the parable of the lost sheep and put focus on the fact that the sheep was lost. Or we might even think about it as a story about the good shepherd. But the parable of the good shepherd is actually a different story about how well the shepherd knows each of the sheep. The point of this story is to think about what it's like to be part of the 99 sheep that stayed together, and how they respond when the shepherd comes back celebrating with the one sheep that was lost. And that group of 99 sheep, for the most part, that's us. That's everyone in this fellowship. So let me try retelling the story with a little more focus on the other 99 sheep, and also try to connect it to our theme today of thinking about the voices in our own faith tradition that have been left on the margins or left out altogether. Okay. Once upon a time, there was a flock of 100 Unitarian Universalist sheep. The flock was a really nice group of sheep, if they do say so themselves. Pretty good looking too. They were more open-minded than some of their neighboring flocks, and they had a reputation for welcoming sheep that wandered in looking for a new flock to call home. Their shepherd was mostly pretty good at keeping them safely together, but was sometimes so focused on the safety of the whole flock that they didn't always pay attention to the individuals. If she had been looking more carefully, they might have noticed that some of the sheep didn't seem to be as welcomed as he thought they were. And some sheep occasionally got lost or even left on purpose because the other sheep didn't treat them very well. Sometimes part of the flock would notice when these things happened and mention them to the shepherd. The shepherd would usually gather the sheep together and give them a talk about how to be more welcoming and accepting. Several times, the shepherd formed a committee to study the situation, but they never seemed to change much. And truth be told, that particular flock was notoriously difficult to shepherd. They really valued making sure that every voice was heard, but that meant, quite often, smaller groups or individuals got drowned out. Over time, the world changed, and as you might expect, the flock changed. Some of the sheep that normally would have left or just stayed quiet started to stick around and speak up more about what they had noticed. More and more of the flock started to notice the problems, and some of those who had left even came back to talk about what had happened to them. Finally, it felt like things were going to change. The shepherd gathered with all the sheep together, and that's where this story ends for now. I can't tell you the rest because it hasn't happened yet. I wonder how it might end. And I wonder who you identified with. Did you see yourself in the shepherd, in the sheep that felt out or lost? Or are you part of the 99 who feel mostly comfortable and cared for, or maybe a little bit of each? As we think more today about the voices in our UU tradition, our flock, who have been left out, I wonder how we might create the next chapter in that story. How can we start to hear some of the voices that we haven't heard as loudly? How can we take better care to notice who is feeling left out or uncared for? And how can we change the way we do things to be more welcoming and inclusive flock where all our voices are heard? Thank you.
So there's no children's recessional today because I guess everybody's staying here. And that reminds me that we should all think about Mary and wish her well in her recovery from her hip surgery. And also, I forgot to mention during the announcements that Margot had a sort of medical emergency over the weekend. On Friday, I think she went into the hospital for a heart murmur kind of thing. And though they wanted her to stay, she went home and she said she's feeling better now, but she wanted us to keep her in our thoughts and prayers.
I think there is RE.
Is there?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I went back there. They're getting ready. So yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I jumped the gun. Do we want to sing them out or? Okay. Okay, hit it, Barbara. Thank you for whoever is taking care of the children today. All right, if you would like to stand, if you feel willing and able, we'll sing hymn number 95 in the gray hymnal, There's More Love Somewhere. Isaac Castro is a recent Master of Divinity graduate of Star King School for Ministry while pursuing UU Ministerial Fellowship. He comes to Unitarian Universalism through his family's multi-religious Christian, Catholic, and Mesoamerican faith practices. Please welcome Isaac Castro.
If I'm reading this correctly, this is the part of our service where we extinguish the chalice in memory of Reverend Dr. Carolyn Owen Toll right now. I could say a lot about Reverend Dr. Carolyn Owen Toll. They were a great person, always friendly with me at First UU, big supporter when I decided to go to seminary, and always kept up with me every time we saw each other about what I was pursuing and what was happening in my formation process. So It is a practice in New Faith tradition that we, when we extinguish a flame, oh, we're not at that photo yet. I don't know who put that up, sorry, but yeah. So it's a practice for our chalice that we extinguish the flame to recognize this person as no longer being with us in person. And it is always hard every time we extinguish that flame for the people that leave us. And then after this moment, we always remind ourselves that we relight our flame, knowing that they always live in on our hearts and our spirit forever.
I don't know if you know, Isaac, that Tom and Carolyn were a part of this community for 2 years. They were our interim minister and have a big place in our heart. And Carolyn, also, she was actually supposed to speak last week and wasn't unable to do so. So we wish Tom well, and Carolyn is out there. That's a good picture of her there.
There we go.
Okay, let's see if technology works the way it's supposed to. Remembering that we do not walk alone. May we remember that we never walk out into the world alone. We stand on the shoulders of brave and generous ones who have gone before. We walk beside companions ready to catch us when we fall. We hold memories of dear ones in our hearts who keep us connected to, okay, I can't read the last line, sorry. Who keep us connected. May we make this most important work to remember that who we are does not end at the edges of our own skin. Amen. We're back.
The first time I joined worship at my home congregation, First U San Diego, I sat in the back seats. So if you're a backseat person, yeah, I'm right there with you. I was only a guest visiting that sacred space, and sitting up front seemed inappropriate to me. I was also nervous as I didn't know much about this faith. One of the first things I noticed at that congregation was there was no religious symbols hanging on the walls. I kept looking around, trying to find something that looked familiar. I did eventually notice a beautiful chalice being lit as worship began, and the spirit of love invoked in the kindling of that flame. The second thing I recall doing, and they still do it, is our children's affirmation with hand motions. It should be familiar if you've ever been to worship there. We're Unitarians, Universalists, people of open minds, loving hearts, and welcoming hands. I stumbled a bit through those actions the first day. I was about a gesture behind everyone in my attempt to keep up. I remember telling myself that I better do this or it'll be evident that I was a first-time visitor here. I didn't need to do that. Everyone knew I was a first-time visitor there. Yeah. After worship, I went home and thought about how that flaming chalice stood out and about those hand motions. I contemplated, What does that chalice mean to them? Why invoke love while lighting the flame? How long have they been doing those hand gestures for? Why do they do those hand gestures? Do all UU congregations do those things? Of people of open minds, loving hearts, and welcoming hands, guided by the flame of love. And hand gestures aside, I'd say it's a pretty good description of the people of this faith. So much so that I often use it as part of my elevator speech when folks ask about the UU denomination. That first worship, I found myself committing to the affirmation, hand gestures and all, and felt the loving warmth of that chalice. I found out later that the chalice lighting is done throughout aspects of this faith, but that children's affirmation isn't something other congregations do. It's uniquely part of the character and history of First UU San Diego. Similarly, I've already witnessed some of its unique characteristics and history that are embraced here. The early Universalists, both laity and clergy, also had a distinctive character that set them apart from other liberal religionists. Unlike the typical urban Unitarian clergy, many early Universalist preachers were rough-hewn circuit riders with little formal education who worked the frontiers, where they challenged the theology of Calvinist hellfire and brimstone preachers were spreading across the continent at tent meetings and revivals. The 19th century Universalists took such pride in their ministers' humble backgrounds that it was an article of faith among them that the best way to ruin a good minister was to send them to theological school. I learned that when I was way too deep in when I learned that. So, in 1860, the message of Universalism, the everlasting love of God, was so intolerable to Calvinists that a Presbyterian minister at Canton, New York, delivered a day-long diatribe against the establishment of the Universalist St. Lawrence University on the slope overlooking the village. At one point in the sermon, he called St. Lawrence that dung heap on the hill. Now, I'd like to interpret this as understanding you were doing something right in your faith if you had a few religious haters during that time. During those years, debates took place between Universalists and their theological rivals. One of the most unusual involved Noah Murray, a minister in mid-Pennsylvania who had begun a Universalist church and was the fastest growing congregation in that area. It finally grew so large that the two local mainline preachers decided they had better do something about it. They kidnapped Noah Murray and took him to the basement of one of their churches, where they kept him for 3 days and 3 nights. And what did they do with him? They argued theology. 3 days, 3 nights, arguing theology in a church basement. At the end of that time, Noah Murray was set free, having converted both of them. After coming across this, what continued to excite me the most about Universalist tradition was the stories about the people in this faith and how they lived out their values in society and did so with deep love for Universalism. Now, I could sketch out stories about some of the greats we have in our faith community's history. George de Benneville, John Murray, Hosea Ballou, Clarence Russell Skinner, Elhanan Winchester, John Greenleaf Adams, Thomas Starr King, Thomas Porter, Olympia Brown, who was the first woman ordained a Universalist minister, Abraham Lincoln, P.T. Barnum, Clara Barton, Florence Nightingale, and many more. Still, articles, sermons, books, and even movies have been made about some of these folks. Instead, what rang true to me were the words from Reverend Janet Bowering. She shares, in a way, perhaps a superficial way, I know more than I want to about several of our UU greats. I do not minimize their achievements. I simply note that we may emphasize them to the neglect of other worthy contributors to our movement. If we fill up t-shirts and coffee mugs with these names, are we more likely to content ourselves without even pursuing the contributions of less prominent UUs? And I want to share a small but mighty story about the Universalist Reverend Janet Bowering. She was ordained in 1955, pre-merger. She is remembered via these words. Her sense of social justice was strong, unflappable, and at times even comical, as this diminutive, white-haired little old lady once packed a suitcase full of condoms to take to Romania to protest the lack of birth control practices. Detained by Romanian customs, she somehow managed to keep out of jail by convincing the authorities that she was a harmless minister and just following her conscience. Surprisingly, they let her go, condoms and all. She made it. Of course, after learning about this story, I immediately fell in love with her. How could I not? And her original words were true. I wanted to pursue knowledge of less prominent folks in our faith. There were many reasons why. First, of course, it's fun to learn about new folks. Second, to witness how they championed love and social justice throughout society in their periods. And lastly, because as a person of color in our faith seeking ordination, I wanted to search for folks I could begin relating to more whenever the denomination's history came up. Throughout my seminary journey, I still had to learn the basics of Universalism faith. I couldn't just focus on looking up the lesser known folks. It's worth sharing that you indeed learn a great deal of history of your faith while in seminary. A good summation of Universalism history will say that liberalism, freedom of individual interpretation, tolerance of diversity, agreement on methods of appropriate theological and church issues, and belief in the inherent dignity of each have been the strongest elements keeping the movement together. In addition, Universalists generally stress the use of reason and religion and the modification of belief in light of the discoveries of science. Jesus is considered a great teacher and an example worthy of imitation, but he's not considered divine. And I know there's several Universalist Christians who would argue with me on that, and I welcome it. And while I was learning about the faith's history, values, and principles, I kept getting pulled back into finding out the stories of its people. And I made a grim discovery. In 1979, 10 years after the 1969 General Assembly in Boston, almost no scholarship existed about African Americans and Unitarian Universalism. And some of what had been written were inaccurate. I was a bit shocked by this. I remember my professor, Reverend Meg Richardson, lecturing on the truths that come up while delving through history are not always good. And while I know it's gotten better, it's still a hard fact to swallow. In 2017, Reverend Mark Morrison Reed wrote a UU World piece titled The Black Hole in the White UU Psych, stating African Americans were invisible in our scholarship, their absence reflected the belief and contributed to the belief that there was no story to tell. Yet African Americans have been founding members of Universalist, Unitarian, and UU congregations as early as 1785, when Gloucester Dalton was the signature at the founding of John Murray's Universalist congregation. Other founding members include Amy Scott, one of the incorporators of the first Universalist Society in Philadelphia in 1801. After reading that article, I dedicated some time to searching out African Americans in our faith. One that I came across was that of Joseph Jordan. It's spelled Jordan, but it's pronounced Jordan. So Joseph Jordan was the first African American to be ordained as a minister by the Universalist denomination. He founded the first Universalist Church of Norfolk, Virginia in 1887 and initiated an educational effort for African American children in Norfolk and its vicinity. The mission and schools that were his legacy served thousands of children and families in Eastern Virginia for over a century. It was said that Jordan felt deeply about religion. By 1880, he had been ordained a Baptist minister, and a few years later, a Methodist colleague gave him Thomas Whittemore's The Plain Guide to Universalism, which was originally published in 1840, and asked him what he thought about it. The book made an immediate, powerful, and lasting impression on him. Whittemore's book explains the goodness of the universe, the loving parental guidance of the Almighty for all of humanity, and the promise of salvation for all. It's not known which particular pages and passages attracted Jordan, but Whittemore makes it clear that Universalism was not a religion for the bigoted, but for those who could accept that God's love is extended equally to all, the powerless and the powerful, the oppressed and the oppressors. Mark Morrison Reed shares that in 1911, Joseph Jordan asked Universalists to support plans to add a seminary to the African American school he ran in Suffolk, Virginia. They needed $6,000 for this endeavor. Good amount of money back then. Jordan traveled around the Northeast from 1911 to 1912, raising that money, but in the end, he raised less than $1,500. There wasn't enough support at the time for the mission of the colored people. It's been complex learning about these histories. And as I said, part of my ministry is lifting up those voices within the margins of our faith. I know part of my search was my attempt to build that more profound connection with this faith, to see that someone like me was part of our history and that I wasn't the first. I recall going to a conference and asking someone if there were currently anyone like me, a queer Latino man who's a UU minister. One of the reasons I was asking was that I didn't want to be the first. There's always a lot of pressure being the first. You know, you gotta represent multiple diverse groups and new spaces. And I was gonna pursue ministry no matter what, and it was important to know that I wasn't going it alone. I'm happy to report there are folks who fit that demographic within our faith and our faith's ministry, but the ones I was steered towards were still part of our present, not our history. Their marks in history were still being written. I knew I was asking a lot to find a queer Latino man to show up in our faith's history. That is, until he was found. I want to introduce you to Reverend Wallace de Ortega Maxey. First, I must offer that I did not discover the history of Reverend Maxey on my own. It was Reverend Mark Harris who shared his story and ministry at the Collegium in Baltimore, Maryland. Harris highlighted Maxey during his spotlight lecture entitled Bringing Up the Bodies. During this lecture, I learned that Maxey was most known for being a Catholic bishop during the 20th century, but he also served as a Universalist minister for several years. Besides serving as a minister, Maxey was instrumental in the Madison Society, which is the early gay civil rights organization. On September 11, 1949, Maxey was installed as a minister at the First Universalist Church of Los Angeles. By 1952, he was comfortable enough to begin living in the rectory with his lover, Robert Hernandez de Anda. Along with his involvement in the Madison Society and using the congregation as a place to host their meetings and other activities, an example would be drag shows that they had there. One could argue that Maxey was the first openly gay minister and gay activist serving our denomination. This knowledge sent a chill through my body. It's important to note that our denomination currently has many openly queer ministers. Some of the earliest we had on record could be traced back to the early 1990s, perhaps a few in the late 80s. However, to know that Maxey was part of our faith and was instrumental as an openly gay activist during the 40s and 50s was astonishing. I had never heard of him before. Even some folks attending the Collegium were gobsmacked at learning about him. You could hear a wow across the audience that evoked so much because we all knew the climate in the United States during that time for gay people. Harris expressed grief in only learning about Maxey from a history paper one of his students submitted. It was a profound moment from a historian in our denomination to share that we are still excavating the history of buried bodies in our faith. After the Collegium concluded, I ventured to learn more about Maxey. Unfortunately, I couldn't find anything about him through the UUA site or UU history affiliated archives, and you still won't find anything about him in those spaces regarding him. Nothing, and I mean nothing, can be found that mentions him in our scholarship. Well, now that I started giving the sermon, you can find that, but yeah. However, LGBTQreligiousarchives.org offers a profile of his life while serving as a religious professional and afterward. I should mention, his history is not without its questionable points. And as I said earlier, that is the fact that occurs when we delve into learning about another's history. We don't always like what's discovered. Still, his ministry deserves to hold a more significant mark in the Universalist history of our denomination. One can argue that Maxey wasn't included as part of our faith's history since he was initially a Catholic bishop. But if we hold the practice that congregations have the power to ordain and call the ministers who serve our faith, then he must be included. It was also groundbreaking for the first Universalist Church of Los Angeles to have Maxey serve as the minister leading their faith. I want to recognize that they took on a lot of risks to be housing an openly gay man during that period. Yet it was beautiful to see that one of our Universalist congregations was living out its values during that time. I'll say that when thinking of Universalist values being lived out, the one that emerges first for me is love. So I have to ask, what does love demand of us? What does our faith's love demand of us? For some, that love demands that we debate theology for 3 days in the basement of a church with ministers and of other faiths. For others, that love demands that we take a suitcase of condoms to Romania to protest the lack of birth control practices. Another love demand would be to start your own Universalist church and schools to serve your Black community, even if the larger faith wasn't ready to support you more. And love demands of others to answer the call and become a Universalist minister in Los Angeles to a congregation who supports your ministry as an openly gay man doing vital social justice work in the 40s and 50s. And while those are the demands of love that were answered by folks in our faith's history, it offers space for a more personal ask. What does love demand of me? What does our faith's love demand of me? It's a question I grapple with regularly, but for now, I know part of that answer is to live out my ministry wholly. Another feature is to share these stories and voices I've discovered from within the margins of our faith's history with each of you, and to not be fearful of publicizing my queer Latino love self for future readers of our faith's history, because I want them to be able to find me. The scholarly work we do in our faith has always been important, and it matters now more than ever that we are diligent in uncovering those voices that were hidden and buried away. Beloveds, as you live out the values of this faith, I want you to remember that there are so many that come before us, and there are many more that we have yet to uncover still. There is also an infinite number that will come after us as we become part of their history. I uncover the history of my congregation's unique gestures of people of open minds, loving hearts, and welcoming hands as a way to strengthen my connection with this faith. So please take note when you light this chalice with the spirit of love and do all the beloved elements that make Summit Fellowship what it currently is, practices that are uniquely part of your fellowship's history and character. I must ask, what does our faith's love demand of you? Are we living up to what is being asked of us by the spirit of love that lights this chalice before us? Together, we can live up to our greatest potential in serving one another through this faith's love, as those from our uncovered history have shown us. We need only be brave enough to answer these questions and help one another as we continue. The larger UU community has shown me the love and support this faith offers firsthand multiple times. We must continue harnessing that energy for good as we move forward together. What does our faith's love demand of you? It's time each of us answers that call. Amen, and blessed be.
Thank you, Isaac. That was very illuminating. I appreciate learning exactly the point of your thing, which is to find those less noticeable, like you know about Thoreau and those kind of people, but you don't know about people that are really have to go fearlessly into the world. And so thank you. Your Sunday morning offering is a gift that provides Summit UU Fellowship the financial resources to help build a better world together. The smallest gift is welcome. For those of you on Zoom, the link can be found in the chat box. Please select the Sunday plate option to allocate your donation to the appropriate account. Barbara?
In the spirit of Universalism, this is a traditional Hindu devotional song, Raghupati, and it is arranged by beloved UU composer and choral director Cliff Hardin.
Well, anyway, it was just so joyful. I saw people in the audience down there in the congregation bobbing their heads and tapping their feet and stuff. That was great. I love how you always bring such unusual pieces, and you're always full of life. Yeah. So you have a chance to stand and sing together in the gray hymnal, hymn 123, Spirit of Life. We close our extinguish the chalice as we close our service, and you're invited to stay afterwards for a time of community discussion, and across the parking lot in the salon for coffee we'll have our chalice lighting and then circle song.
Today's extinguishing words come from Universalist Reverend Olympia Snow. Dear friends, side with this faith. Work for it and sacrifice for it. There is nothing in all the world so important to you as to be loyal to this faith, which has placed before you the loftiest ideals, which has comforted you in sorrow, strengthened you for noble duty, and made the world beautiful for you. Do not demand immediate results, but rejoice that you are worthy to be entrusted with this great message and that you are strong enough to work for a great true principle without counting the cost. Go finding ever new applications of these truths and new enjoyments in their contemplation.
Okay, closing circle song. So after the circle song, we'll have a 5-minute break, and then we'll have a discussion period. And those of you who would rather go get a cup of coffee, across the parking lot. Circle song.